Okay, welcome everybody. Good afternoon, attendees. As a reminder, all persons wishing to speak during public comment or to an item must complete a speaker slip online by visiting the public meetings page at ebce.org prior to the start of the meeting. For those that are calling in from a landline, please email your comments to cov@ebce.org before the meeting. All speakers must sign up before the item is called. When the chair opens the discussion to public comment, please use the raise hand feature when your name is called. The clerk will unmute your microphone when it is your turn to speak. That's me. You will have 3 minutes to make your comment. The chair may elect to shorten the time to allow for more speakers. If you're calling in by phone, press #9 to use the raise hand feature. And with that, we can perhaps go on to roll call. So, Hayward?
I'm here.
Okay. Oakland is not here yet. And San Leandro?
Present.
Present. Okay. Right. And we can go on to public comment. And
Yes,
we have, hold on one second. We have several speakers. Let me just pull up our speaker list. We have Ed Mateus and Audrey Ichinose. And so I am going to unmute Ed.
Adrian, Adrian, before you do that, it looks like Tim Rude, who's one of our board members, has his hand raised.
Okay, I'll go to Tim Rude. And I don't see Ed Mateus in the attendees as of yet.
and we
So
normally
I'll
give
go
people
ahead to do Tim Rude and then Audrey Ichinose.
and we normally give people about 3 minutes. That's agreeable to
Yes.
Director Mendel.
3 minutes?
Thank you.
Okay, hold on one second. Let me go ahead and share. Okay, hold on one.
I'm not sure, Adrian, I'm not sure that Tim is even seeking to public comment. I just wanted to make sure that
I'm trying to get into the meeting.
Yeah, I think that's what we're trying to do. So I just want you to let
I'm
Tim,
promoting
so we
him
can try to
now.
figure out how do we get him in. So
Is
Very
Tim part of the
nice.
committee? I can't recall.
I didn't think so.
I do not believe Tim is on this committee. Obviously, Tim is a member of the board, though.
Correct.
Great.
Yeah.
Then, therefore, I will allow. I'm unmuting Audrey Ichinose, and she'll have 3 minutes to talk.
Adrian, I signed up to speak to items 4 and 5. Should I make those comments now?
I see. You were signed up. There's a third entry that you have here that I thought was public comment. My apologies.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
Would you prefer to speak now or during the?
No, I think it's more. You know, it makes more sense to speak to the individual items if you don't mind.
Okay. Great. Then we can move on to the approval of minutes. I can go ahead and return to the. You can make the comments during that item.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Director Mendel, may look for a motion from you for approval of the minutes.
Yeah, so moved.
No, so second.
Okay.
Chair Clerk, do you want to do a quick roll of the vote?
Yes. Hold on one second. Oakland. Yes, I'm calling a roll call for a vote for the minutes. San Leandro?
Yes.
And Hayward?
Yes.
Yes, the motion passes. The minutes pass. Okay. And
We'll move up to the financial update.
yes, hold on one second while I pull that up.
And who's presenting this update?
Jason's going to present on this.
Okay. Does Jason want to present his screen, or we're going to let clerk?
Yes. Yes, I have that. Just one second.
And for those on attendees, I believe they have updated the agenda, and that's on the EBCE website under agendas, and there might be some updates there as well. If you have questions or concerns, they refresh that information on the website for these presentations that you're seeing today.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, very good, thank you. Thank you for today. I will be discussing two kind of key updates in relation to finance. One will be an update on the progress of the audit, and the other will be a review of a resolution that we have before the board this month regarding a rate stabilization fund. So yes, Adrian, if you could please go to the next slide. Thank you. So just to kind of touch base on where we're at with the audit, all stages are on track. All external confirmations that are required have been delivered, and we are receiving those now. A trial balance has been delivered to the auditors, which is currently being evaluated for third-party recognition. So no major hiccups that we're seeing at this time. Nothing that would indicate any kind of delay or any sort of foreseeable issue in terms of hindrance with the audit progress. Which brings us to kind of talking about the timelines. We're expected to have a final draft delivered sometime after the week of the 28th. There is we're the 7th is listed there as an extreme outlier. We are expecting it to be within that week of the 28th. Specifically, we did put the 7th there as just to kind of give a couple days buffer in case something unforeseen comes up. Regarding a FAP meeting, I understand that there is not one scheduled for October, but I wanted to put it on the radar in case the FAP committee decided that they did want to schedule a meeting to review the audit prior to going to the board. The board presentation, of course, being on the 21st. So the week of the 5th, we think that between the 5th and the 13th would be a reasonable time. The 9th is the second Friday of the month. But I wanted to reach out to the FAP members to see if they had any thoughts or inputs on that. And that doesn't have to be decided now. I will have Stephanie or Adrian reach out to kind of help solidify a date if you guys think that that's necessary.
That works for me, Jason.
Great.
Yeah, let's get that on the calendar soon. We can always cancel if it's not needed.
Excellent. It's good to hear. Okay, are there any questions regarding the audit progress at this time?
Director Mendel,
Nope, thank you.
Okay.
any concerns about getting the data from SMUD? Anything like that? Is that all working for the right?
Good question. We actually have received that yesterday. So that has now been passed on to the auditors also yesterday. So there doesn't seem to be any red flags at this time with that.
Great. Thank you very much. Look forward to the report and then October 9th around the same time, 3 o'clock. I'm assuming we'd schedule it for that period.
That would make sense. I think,
Okay.
yes.
Sounds good.
Cool. All right. And so I'll have Stephanie or Adrian reach out to put a solid pin in that.
Okay.
Okay, if we could please go to the next slide, Adrian. So we're bringing to the board this month a recommendation to approve a rate stabilization fund. Under the Government Accounting Standard Board's Rule 62, it allows for government enterprises of our sort to defer revenues earned in strong years to then be recognized in weaker years. The purpose of it is to generally, fortify net position and help stabilize the need to adjust rates in any given specific year. So, for example, if we have, if it turns out that we're receiving negative position in any one of our quarters, if we did not have deferred revenues, then that might indicate an adjustment to rates. If we have deferred revenues from stronger years, we could then recognize them in that weaker period to prevent fluctuations in the rates for our customers. At this point is, so to preface, we did have a very strong year last year with what we would consider to be a surplus of funds that above what was approved by the budget. And this deferral would come out of that surplus. So it would not in any way necessarily impact budgeted amounts or board approved amounts from last year. And so it would be reduce the net, however, it would reduce the net position on the financial statements by the amount that we defer. And so that would be in that buffer of our surplus where that reduction would be seen. And then in future periods when it is needed, it would also, instead of a reduction in that position, it would create an increase in that position, which could then help balance any possible deficits or shortfalls. Now, to be clear, this is not to be held, this is not the same as our cash position, as this is, as it's managed by our reserve funds and by our treasurer. This is in accrued revenue, and to be held as realized or unrealized revenues and costs. Adrian, if you could please go to the next slide. So here's a little bit more detail on what I've been discussing. We're recommending the strong performance that we've seen last year is around the order of $22 million. So we're recommending a deferral of about 12.7 million of that. We came to this number based upon the local development budget. It includes the unspent amount from last year as well as the full budget for this current year. We believe that by setting this aside, it will help ensure that the board's and our organization's determination to meet our local development needs are met without having any impact on rates. This fund will also help stabilize short-term variations in other areas if needed. But primarily it will align with the board's intentions based on their approval of the budget in June. And so because this is a revenue accounting treatment, not a cash accounting treatment, it is not expected to impact the ongoing performance or reserve allocations for this year's cash reserve distribution amount. Now that said, are there any questions or clarifications needed at this point?
Let's see, Director Mandel.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm not quite getting it here. So
Okay.
I know that I thought that we already had a rate stabilization fund, and this, I can't tell if this is the same fund or a different fund, and I'm also unclear as to it sounds like you're talking about this as sort of a general surplus, but then we're calling it rate stabilization, which would imply to me that it's only able to be used for rate stabilization. But then you mentioned the local development business plan. So I'm not following. I apologize.
Okay.
So maybe,
Yeah.
Jason, maybe let me step in here just to make sure to clarify that. So
Sure. Absolutely.
rate stabilization, GASB 62 is the specific accounting sort of rule that actually allows for this type of a revenue deferral fund. It is separate and entirely distinct from the rate stabilization reserve that we have. So they share a name, and perhaps that was, maybe we should have called it something else to avoid that confusion, but they are entirely separate. So our reserve funds and our reserve policy that we have had approved relate to cash and cash only. And what we're talking about here is a revenue deferral fund. So they're, as a starting point, totally separate our reserve funds from what we have here is the rate stabilization GASB 62 fund. This is a revenue deferral fund. So it's an accounting treatment that basically allows us to take revenues from one year and defer it into another year. And the reason why we are recommending actually creating this to begin with, the impetus for this is because we had approximately $4 million of underspent local development budget from the 2019 to 2020 fiscal year, if you recall. And so we had, talked to the board about, let's make sure we continue to earmark those funds for this current fiscal year, 2020 to 2021, and ensure we don't just, don't spend those and just forget about it. We want to make sure we continue to sort of invest and commit those funds for local development purposes. And so as we revisited that with our accountant, we realized, well, if we're going to do that, we're really just shifting those costs into a different period. We're shifting that burden to a different period. So yes, we can, of course, earmark that and just continue to budget that amount, but really we're not able to sort of, take advantage of the fact that we had a strong year in the 2019 to 2020 fiscal year and spend the local development funds in that year. So the best way to do that was to create basically a revenue deferral fund to allow for that shifting of costs from one year to the other, given that the last fiscal year was a very strong one. So that was the sort of impetus for why we wanted to create this type of fund, which is, again, it's a revenue deferral fund. We happen to call it a rate stabilization GASB 62 fund because at the end of the day, it's an accounting treatment based off of revenue deferral. So you can use it certainly for any purpose that the board sort of says is okay. In this case, we're doing it primarily to defer some of the expenses that we had budgeted last year for local development purposes. We're going over and above that and saying, let's put in a greater amount than just the $4 million because it was a very strong year. We exceeded our budget, and of course, we will present some of these results when complete the audit in our financial statements. But right now, the unaudited estimate is that we're exceeding our last year's budget by about $22 million. So very strong surplus from the prior year. And so we felt like it was prudent to put more than just $4 million into this revenue deferral fund because, as we all know, this year is a particularly tight budget year. And so wanted to go and put a larger amount. We felt like maybe putting $22 million wasn't the right number. So middle ground.
So okay, thank you for the clarification. So what, I think I get it. So what's the harm in just accepting the revenue when we received it last year and showing a deficit, effectively this year? Because, I mean, there's no need for this. We're not generating revenue. We're just moving it around for accounting purposes. And I'm not quite understanding the.
Sure. So I think I can answer that on two levels. One is that from a budget and financial statement position, yes, the cash is there. We have it. We can use it. But when we present our financial statements at the end of the new year, those costs that are carried over in local development for last year are recognized this year and could create what appears to be a negative net position on the year, and that could be detrimental for credit rating purposes, as well as for locking in, low rates on collateral statements and stuff like that with some of our counterparties. The second reason that that this is a good idea is that we with our budget, we essentially promised that we would spend that money last year, and we didn't. So if we're going to spend that money again this year and collect revenues on that expense on our budget statement, then it's not exactly double dipping, but it seems like it's not properly accounting for those expenses and when we planned to use them.
So, okay, so I get that if we had 4 million in local development business budget allocation last year that we didn't spend, and we're rolling it over into this year, rolling over 4 million in revenue would sort of make sense. I could get my head around that.
Right.
So, and I'm just trying to decide whether adding an additional 8 million.
Well,
is there a justifiable reason for that other than
there is?
Looks better to have 2 years that
I don't
show a
actually.
deficit rather than.
I think that's the primary reason, right? Is it's a purely accounting treatment. It's a time treatment here of the revenues, and we're pushing it from one period to the other for the purpose of managing any sort of potential deficit that may occur in the net position. The primary benefit of that is mostly because of sort of credit rating process where they sort of evaluate your financials. Now they see that, so we're not hiding the ball in any way. They see, okay, you deferred revenues from one period to the other. I think the perception of that, for what it's worth, is okay. It's a sort of fiscally prudent approach to sort of deferring revenues from a weaker period and putting it into a stronger period, sort of in order to ensure that you are maintaining sort of a positive net position. The guidance we've gotten from our accountant and speaking to certain financial advisors is there's some value to that. Is that really make a difference between an investment grade entity or not? Not necessarily, but there are a number of municipal utilities that basically have rate stabilization funds created for this purpose. Take strong years to make sure that you have a little bit of extra revenue to carry over to some years. So it's really that. I think you are understanding the issue here, Director Mundell, and it's not a very significant one. I think the impetus of this was really the $4 million and ensuring that what we wanted to spend last year and we didn't incorrectly create a deficit for us this year, because had we spent it last year, we wouldn't have those additional expenses now. So that's the reason for creating this, and our recommendation is to go a little bit over and beyond that, because we feel like that having a little extra cushion for revenue deferral would be beneficial, purely from a financial statement perspective.
Okay, Director Hernandez, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this.
Thank you. Just back to and thank you for those clarifying questions and bringing up the rate stabilization reserve, sort of differentiate those two items. I'm hearing the net position, and I want to understand, are we talking more about a balance sheet or a statement of cash flows and those reserve and those funds, and where will we see them in our financials?
Our net position actually is speaking to our earnings, so the income statement actually.
The income statement. And will you be drafting some of those income statements with these, so we could see that how it balances out between the 2 years if we move forward with this? Will we have that ready? Like an income
statement. For the board meeting?
Yeah.
Speaking of the board meeting?
Yeah, I'm just thinking so you have more of a visual. This is how we would have it generally speaking in this year, but we're deferring this money and it's more smooth over those 2 periods, and then therefore we look more favorable in that 2-year period. So that's something, maybe it's more visual, so people who are more visual can hear what you're saying, but also see sort of the financial smoothing on your income statement. And just to be clear, because I don't do too much accounting, but I know the 3 of them. So I shot for 2 out of 3 documents.
So we won't have, as part of the current board prepared materials with this item, we don't have draft financial statements, because we generally don't want to publish financial statements that are unaudited, because then they might get viewed and say, oh, this is your financial statement, and we're just setting a couple different scenarios for you. The at least summarize for you here, and certainly can go into the same level of detail during the board meeting as well. But really the impact is your revenues would decrease in your income statement, and therefore your net position would also decrease. So your sort of what is equivalent to your net earnings would decrease.
So would you be able to show our net position without the treatment and with the treatment? Would you be able to show that level of detail to the board?
So in the board memo that is going to be released later today, I believe, there is the net position balance that's above the surplus. We're talking about a $22 million surplus above the budgeted net position. Those are the revenues to which we are referring. So we were projecting around 60 million in positive net position. Our preliminary statements are coming in around 82. So we're talking about that difference in there.
The $22 million, but you're looking to move over about $13 million into the current fiscal year. So that way, when you have the extra 13 million, you can also balance that off of the, was it 4 million for the local development business plan? And then your position sort of shows a more imbalance because you're deferring costs and you're deferring revenue, and you're trying to smooth out your position so that way it's more smooth over time and you don't have that sort of fluctuation, which then would drive to believe that you need to increase rates or decrease rates in given years. So you're actually more smoothing out the situation so that way rates can stay generally more consistent because the deferred account treatment has the funds there to drive that smoothing out, and it's more consistent year over year without having to have that variation in funds.
Exactly. That's almost exactly it, the concept.
I'm not a CPA. I don't try to be one. So, you know, I just play one on TV.
Celebrity CPAs. I've seen that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So exactly. And the idea is that you know, we went above the 4 million for the local development specifically for a couple of reasons. One, we have it, and this next year we're in a very tight year in terms of our net margin position. And, you know, we wanted to ensure that we at least had enough deferred to cover for the totality of local development spending for the current year. And then the extra couple million, you know, that reflects both years' budgets in their entirety. Granted that about 2 is realized for a local development budget, but in terms of revenues, that gives us a little bit more room with other cost fluctuations that might come up, such as what we've just seen with the heat wave that we just had in terms of, you know, with market prices. And so that will help stabilize and keep smooth our net position through, or at least keep it as positive and keep our budget to actual comparison smooth between the years.
And I think it's important to recognize this is not new cash that we're going to have in the next fiscal year. It's more of a cash position. It's not like we have an extra $1 million to spend. It just, we want to smooth it out. And I also want to recognize Director Calp has joined us as well. So if you maybe want to have a few questions or clarifying points, we're talking about an accounting treatment of deferring some revenue in one fiscal year to another fiscal year, as we've deferred $4 million in the local development business plan. And this is also different from the reserve fund that is proposed and accepted by the board. So I don't know, Director Calb, if you want to jump in and say any comments about the item on the agenda.
And I'm fine. Not yet. I came in at about 10 minutes ago, so sorry for being late. My apologies.
No worries. So yeah, just want to make sure I offer you the opportunity to have any clarifying comments or questions, because I believe this is a recommendation that staff is going to bring to the full board to defer the $12.68 million into the subsequent fiscal year, such as the local development business plan has also been deferred in that cash position to have more of a net position, a positive one that's smoothed out in that income statement. So that way we can be afforded more of a credit positive position and lower costs. And I think it's something that's recommended by our accounting subject matter experts and other members of the team. Is that the summary that maybe I can walk away with? Mr. Bartlett?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's a good briefing. If there are specific questions that Director Calv has, you know, we can talk to those.
Okay. Hearing none, do you have any public comment on this?
There you go. Thank you.
Yes, I am going to unmute Audrey Ichinose. Hold on one
Okay.
second.
Okay.
She's still unmuted, so she'll have to unmute herself one more time, maybe.
Yes,
Bay.
exactly. Thank you.
My pleasure.
That was very enlightening, and thank you very much for including, you know, public participation in this. I am a member of the East Bay Clean Power Alliance, and you know, it's really important for everybody to get a handle on the financials of this agency. And unfortunately, there aren't many of us who want to try to do it, try to stick with you. But I did want some reassurance. Thank you very much. I really profited from the questions and the discussion. But I want to have some assurance. This is purely accounting, and it has nothing to do with this fiscal year's budget for local development. I don't know what the figure is for this year, but does this mean that you're trying to ensure that there's 4 million carried over from last year that is at the disposal for local development? Is that right?
I'll direct staff to respond to that question if they choose to do so.
Yeah, yes, that is correct.
Great.
We are ensuring that the money that we promised to be spent in local development is spent on local development.
Okay, so that's for this year. So I guess, and this will come up in relation to the next item, when, you know, it's clear that we have to mobilize to ensure grid stability, I mean, resource adequacy, all of that. And so all of these funds can be spent this year. Is that right?
We'll look to that item. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes, they could be spent in the current year. That's correct.
Great. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much. I guess, you know, if you feel up to it, I would love to hear some account of why we had such a strong year. Maybe it's just a kind of habit for me, but I always think we enter the fiscal year sort of with bated breath and hope, straining to do better, but now we have this unexpectedly strong performance. Is there a specific reason or reasons that you can cite for this?
I think it's probably better to go over the fully audited financials to really go through that process. At this stage, they're sort of in the audit process. So before we sort of overcommit ourselves to any specific numbers, I think the quick high level response is, there's a whole number of factors that play into our financials, weather conditions, energy load, the changes in rates and things like that, as well as, of course, spending of overhead and executing on our procurement costs. So it's a combination of all those things, and it'd be sort of a gross oversimplification for me to go and say this is, these are the three primary drivers. I think it's better done with kind of detailed numbers, to be honest.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
And thank you for your questions, and we'll look forward to having you in those next subsequent meeting and discussions of our audited financial statements. Right now, proposed, I think, October 9th, we'll be looking at those audited financials around 3 o'clock as well. So thank you for your comments, and I appreciate your time.
We have one more person on the speaker list, Barbara Stebbins.
please.
Go ahead. And
Yes. Okay. I think I'm unmuted. So I agree. Thank you very much. This actually explained a lot of the things that I had questions about, because it was after the very difficult budget meeting in June, in which, and all of the years leading up to that budgeting meeting, in which we were trying to figure out how we were going to get through 2020, 2021 without having kind of a negative net position. It's, this seems like a reasonable solution. I guess what would have helped me is to be able to see that on budget that were presented publicly. And I guess there's no way to do that. Is that what I'm understanding, that this, that basically it's all in the final accounting where you can see that there's 22 million over the 60 million that was projected? The other question I have about that has to do with reserves. In the budget meeting in 2019, in June of 2019, there was a projection of all this money that was going to go into the various reserve pools. And when we actually saw what went in, which I think was in the June meeting, but I can't find it in the presentation, it was significantly less. For almost all of the pools, it was significantly less that went into those reserve accounts. But I assume maybe that was a temporary statement, and so it's just not the complete statement of where the money is going, where it is. And then my last question has to do with the PCIA and how much all of this, the, you know, the concern about the net position plus this attempt to create a rate stabilization has to do with our concerns around this escalating PCIA, and especially triggering the, you know, whatever that mechanism is that will allow them to suddenly collect a whole lot more money than what they have been collecting because of the cap that is set. So those are my kind of comments and questions. Thanks.
And I can ask the committee a quick question. In some of your meetings, I understand that we are able to respond. In some cases, we don't respond to the questions. Since it's a smaller group, are we okay still with staff responding to questions and dialogue? Or do we want to just hear the public comment and then ask staff to follow up with the questions at a later time? Just want to get a sense of where we're at with that kind of ground rule. I'll look to Mindell.
I always think it's good for staff to respond. Generally, I think it's also good for us to take all the questions and then have staff respond to all of them at the end. That way we're not using speakers' time for the answers.
Okay.
But that's just my slight preference.
That's understood. And Director Kalb, choose to respond. Okay. Well, Jason, if you want to, if not, Howard or anybody else from EBCE wants to speak to the questions that were asked around our reserve, our budget. I think a lot of it is the cash position, and the budget's separate. And so that's where we discuss. But go for it.
Yeah, on the reserve aspect, I'm not sure what that was referencing, to be honest. I heard sort of it was a lot lower than expected, but you know, I think we took a specific item to the board. I think it was in November or December of 2019 with, you know, a reserve allocation amount, and you know, that is what was allocated. So I'm not familiar with any kind of discrepancy on that. I can't speak to that, but I would, you know, I would suggest maybe just reviewing that item in the November or December board meetings probably would provide the best clarity.
Were there any other questions? Ms. Stebbins?
Oh, am I still muted?
You can speak. Yeah, if you did we miss anything else?
Oh, just how much of kind of the drive to do this? I mean, I realize
is it related to PCIA, right?
PCIA, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say this is for PCI purposes. I think the real driver of this is, as we noted before, was there was you know, a budgeted local development amount that was in the prior year, and we're trying to transition into the sort of the future year, right? The current fiscal year that we're in. I think that's really the primary driver of this. It is a rate stabilization fund generally, so it can be used for future purposes for other reasons that could include PCIA or others for that matter. I think that is the reason why we called it a rate stabilization fund as opposed to a local development fund, right? We didn't want to be so specific to only be able to utilize this for one purpose if it could have a broader use, just because it's less efficient to have all these multiple funds created for different purposes. So, but it's not specifically for PCI, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other public comment? Because I do see Director Mendel has his hand up.
There are no more public comments.
Director Mendel, you had another comment?
Yeah, thank you. So I appreciate the public comments. So this is going to the board next week. I realize there's not a lot of time, but I think that when it's presented to the board, I would make a couple of changes so that it's a little bit clearer and you won't get all the questions that I asked all over again. First of all, that $4 million local development business fund carryover, that number needs to be in the presentation and in the staff report, showing that there's a commensurate transfer of revenues from one year to the next as well to cover that. I think that's very simple and easy to understand. And then for me, I don't know if it's too late to change the name of this fund, but to me, it should be a budget stabilization, GASB 62 fund, not a rate stabilization. Because you're right. I think one of you mentioned I was thrown off by that. I was confused by that. If it said budget stabilization, I would have got it a little bit quicker. So those are my two suggestions for when it comes to the full board. I think you'll get better understanding from the board when with those changes, if it's possible. Thank you, Chair.
Any feedback from staff?
I think that makes sense. I think we're on the verge of posting some material. So if we don't get it out here, I think we'll at least add some commentary then. I think we could probably make some changes even at the board meeting to adjust names if that's the preference. I think we have that flexibility. So I think we're open to it and we can see if we can try to make some of these comments, incorporate some of these comments before actually posting the board materials too.
Yeah, and especially in the presentation to the board, because that's where we're all going to key in on the most. And that, so what it's technically called, I don't necessarily care. It's the concept that I'm trying to convey more clearly. Thanks.
Understood. Okay.
Yeah, just adding the word of the income statement. I mean, I think that's important. Maybe some people know more of the income statement. And the budget stabilization, I mean, I think it's sort of smoothing out. I think somehow you can convey that if you're just trying to have a sort of like a long-term smooth out environment. So I think it's good to emphasize that. Thank you, Director Mendel. Thank you, Howard. Dr. Calvin, anything else?
No, thank you.
All right, we'll move on to the next item unless we have other matters on this item. Item 5. Thank you.
Hey. So next updates related to power procurement. Adrian, you can actually move to the next slide. We have 3 topics we want to talk about. This order is actually a little bit off relative to this slide, so apologies for that. We'll first talk about the energy prepayment overview. And that is, we'll be taking an action item to the full board next week related to this. And then we have an item related to the August heat wave summary. So that will be an informational item next week. So we just wanted to provide some preliminary information to this committee, that topic. And then the last one is a very brief update just on sort of the planned RFO that we have for this fall to procure additional renewables and storage. Next slide. So we will start with the prepay topic. So this is something that we've raised before in the past to the board to introduce this concept, and now it's starting to sort of come through fruition, and we're beginning to execute on a few pieces of this. The prepay transaction that we're talking about here is locally called an energy prepayment structure. And really how it works is a load-serving entity, a tax-exempt load-serving entity specifically, so municipal utility or CCA as an example, would work with a large taxable financial intermediary or counterparty. In this case, you know, a large institutional bank. There are a number out there that provide these types of prepaid transactions. We would work with them basically to utilize the spread between a taxable and a tax-exempt debt rates, and create a vehicle that would go out and do a municipal bond raise off balance sheet, or I should say a taxable, tax-exempt bond raise off balance sheet. The financial institution would utilize those funds, and then we would assign a variety of our power supply contracts into that vehicle and receive a discount off of that. And so in essence, it's taking advantage of our tax-exempt status, raising debt, utilizing our status, and applying a discount to long-term PPAs that do not have a tax-exempt debt status. That's all what it's intended to try to do. This structure is pretty well codified in U.S. tax law and what it actually allows for it. And it's a very well-tread structure in the natural gas space. So municipal utilities have done many of these transactions specifically for natural gas supply. And we are looking to apply that structure to electricity and likely scenarios where we apply it actually to specific renewables PPA. Go on to the next slide, please. These structures are typically 30-year terms. Again, you have a tax-exempt load-serving entity, in this case, of course, EBCE, and then a taxable financial counterparty. In this case, we have selected Morgan Stanley to represent us as the prepay supplier. Right now, we are looking to move forward with that counterparty to start negotiating documents, after which there would actually be an execution of a bond document to actually issue something. But that is something that would take place in sort of the 3 to 6 month, potentially even longer time frame, but it's not that imminent. It's, it's at least several months from now. The primary reason for that is because the debt markets right now are a little out of sorts, if you will. As you can imagine, with COVID and the recessionary environment, interest rates are sort of out of whack from normal conditions. So the goal really here is to get our documents all in order and be ready to go out to market when conditions present themselves, which right now is certainly not right now, because your tax exempt and your taxable rates actually are a bit inverted. But in normal conditions that would happen. And the timing, of course, is a bit unpredictable because interest rates, of course, are a bit unpredictable. So that's why we want to sort of be ready with our documents when they're ready to go and be ready to go out to market. The 30-year term, we are targeting an 8 to 12% discount on whatever commodities transaction that we would assign into a vehicle like this. There's certainly no guarantees of that. That discount, again, is going to be solely dependent on whatever the sort of spread is between a taxable and a tax-exempt rate. So if it's not there, we're not happy with it, we wouldn't move forward and execute. So that target rate, we have a lot of control over in this initial term when we go out to market and whether we execute or not. The other thing I would flag here is, there certainly are some regulatory risks that we're aware of, and we've been properly due diligencing, and certainly will continue to diligence to ensure that they don't sort of conflict with any of the transactions that we have. There are issues related to SB 350, which are the requirement to have long-term contracts. We want to make sure, obviously, if we assign something to this vehicle, it doesn't sort of disrupt that compliance, obligation that we'd be satisfying. And there are also things related to the emissions performance standard that require certain types of fuels or sources to be the underlying, project that is providing the commodity. So just examples, just to highlight, to say that there are things from a regulatory perspective we want to make sure we're on top of and don't run afoul of any of those rules. And we certainly would do that before we, bring anything forward to the board for approval of actually executing on a bond document. Next slide, Adrian. Thank you. So what's really key to this transaction is a few things. One is that we would look to assign one or a number of our power supply contracts into this type of structure. That could be a long-term PPA, or that could certainly be a shorter-term power hedge contract. So there's no obligation that it needs to be a very specific type of contract or duration of contract. So we have some flexibility, but we do need to get an assignment right in these contracts. So some of our PPAs have that, some of them don't. So that's something that we may have to negotiate with a commodities counterparty to ensure that could be assigned to this vehicle. For all intensive purposes, it doesn't really change the risk profile of the contract, and it doesn't change our obligation. If we were to not perform under the contract, the financial institution, in this case Morgan Stanley, they have every right to put that PPA right back to us, basically. So even though we would be assigning a contract into this structure, in terms of obligation and liability, that structure, that vehicle, has every right to be transferred right back to us. So we're not sheltering ourselves from any responsibility or obligation in this case. We are doing a partial assignment of energy and payments to go through this vehicle so that we can get a discount on it. So that's one key aspect. The other one is that this debt is fully non-recourse and it's off balance sheet. So this is not on EBCE's balance sheet. It would be issued through a conduit. And generally speaking, a lot of municipal bonds typically are issued through some form of a conduit. So this is not unique for this, but it would be issued through a conduit and it would be off balance sheet. And so it wouldn't impact our our debt or the sort of credit evaluation that we would get from from a credit rating agency, I should say. So there's two key aspects. Adrian, next slide, please. This is a structure. This is actually a bit of a simplification of sort of the boxes and arrows related to structure, and there are certain nuances to this that we are in the process of continue to work through with Morgan Stanley. So I won't go over this in too much detail and expect that every single flow needs to make sense. But we did want to provide this as a high-level illustration of what's really happening. And on the right side is sort of the representation of EBCE and the other load-serving entities that would be the power buyer. And on the left side is the actual prepaid supplier. In this case, what we're talking about is Morgan Stanley. And so really what we have is an assignment that's occurring. And so you can see in the bottom right corner, there's an existing PPA that would get assigned over. And that counterparty, or at least a limited portion of that PPA, is then assigned over to the prepay supplier, again, in this case, Morgan Stanley. So some of the obligations would flow through to Morgan Stanley, but at the end of the day, there's an agreement between the CCA, EBCE, and Morgan Stanley that basically keeps us fully obligated to perform in the exact same way that we're obligated to perform under the existing PPA. So it's really just a pass-through. And then in the center box, you have a municipal conduit. And let me talk about that just for a minute. In this case, we are in discussions with a handful of other CCAs about forming a municipal conduit for the purpose of being able to issue the actual tax-exempt bonds that we're talking about here. There are existing conduits in the market right now that we can fully tap into without any issues. They're readily available. We are, in fact, talking about forming this type of a JPA conduit because we could save a bit of money to do so. The fees associated with utilizing the existing market conduits, we find to be a bit expensive, quite frankly, for the services that we get. So for that reason, we're in these discussions to try to form a conduit for some cost saving purposes. I will move on, though I know I addressed that at a high level, so happy to take questions later on. In terms of market statistics here, wanted to just share, of course, some of the basic stats on what's been completed to date. So as I noted, many of these transactions have been done as natural gas prepays. There's 90 plus municipal transactions that have been done nationwide. So not just California. That's about $50+ billion of combined notional contract value. So a very large amount. So a pretty well understood transaction. And of course, you can see a number of them specifically in California. So 11 transactions in California specifically, and close to $6 billion of notional value there. Active suppliers include shops like Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, RBC, Citi, Bank of America. Through our RFP process, we are electing to, or at least recommending, working with Morgan Stanley in that process. One of the reasons that is the case is because they are also a very strong commodity supplier, and we actually work with them on the commodity supply side of things. So given some of the risks I noted before in terms of ensuring that we don't run afoul of some of the regulatory risks and things like that related to our commodities transaction, we felt like working with a counterparty that has a strong commodities background would be beneficial. Lastly of note there, as I already mentioned, largely these transactions have been focused on natural gas in the past. So we were trying to utilize the same structure and benefits of that and apply it towards renewables, even the playing field, if you will. But it is the same tax law that basically enables this type of work, whether it be renewables or natural gas. And of course, there are some structuring nuances that result from that, but that's some of those are pretty down in the weeds. So that's what I wanted to cover. I'll just note, this was, of course, for informational reasons for the Finance and Procurement Subcommittee. We're bringing an item forward to the board next week to cover basically an overview of this structure, similar to what I just provided, but then specifically ask for an action and approval on agreements that we have to sign with legal counsel to support the document negotiation here. And those fees can be contingent or non-contingent. So we'll discuss that a little bit further on next week's board meeting. But here was really primarily focused on explaining the structure to give a preview of that and begin to inform you at a deeper level about this type of a transaction structure. That's what I wanted to cover to prepay. A couple other topics here related to the August heat wave that are unrelated to this. So I can continue or I can pause and take questions here. I'll look for your guidance there.
If you can pause for a minute because I have some questions, but I'll let Dr. Mandel go first if he likes to.
Sure.
A lot of information you just threw at us, so
Yes.
I can't get away without just moving on to the next thing. You'd like to, but I like to take off and go get some ice cream too, but I need to make sure I do my due diligence here. My kids are like, oh, let's go get ice cream, but let's do this first. Go ahead, Director.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a second time in one meeting I'm feeling like an idiot because I'm not quite getting it. So first of all, let me say I appreciate the work you're doing to be innovative here and to take advantage of a credit facility or a finance facility that will save us money. That part's all good. I just want to make sure I have at least a basic understanding of how it works, and I don't have that yet. So if I understood you correctly, the item that comes to the full board next week will be to authorize some lawyers and whatnot to work on developing the authority, and the formal authorization for that authority would come back not next week but at some future meeting. Did I understand that correctly?
Absolutely, that's correct.
Okay, so
executing the actual transaction.
So what I would suggest is that that should come back to this committee first. There should be an action by this committee to recommend approval to the full board first. And before I would be comfortable voting on that future item, I'd want to really grok this at a more fundamental level. I'm not understanding how it saves us money. I'm not quite understanding what sort of contracts might go in there. I'm just not getting it. I maybe don't need to today, which is what I'm sorry for that long preamble. I don't necessarily need to get it today, but when it comes back to the FAP in a month or so before it goes back to the board for authorization, I really want to get it. And so,
Al, that's really helpful, and that's definitely going to be part of our explaining process. I think I sometimes have struggled exactly with the mechanics, so maybe let me try to do a very brief explanation of how I understand the transaction works. Maybe that helps, maybe it doesn't, but no matter what, it's going to come back to the FAP for further discussion. So that's happening. So we have long-term renewable power purchase agreements, wind projects, solar projects. Those contracts are between EBCE and the project developer. Under this structure, those contracts would be assigned from EBCE to the financial institution that is issuing these bonds. And they then, let's just, for round number sake, let's just say the power is being bought at $50 a megawatt hour. Instead of EVCE paying, the financial institution that's issuing the bond is paying $50, then we're in turn paying the financial institution. But the financial institution is benefiting from EVCE's status as a public agency and the tax code that allows for this interest rate arbitrage on commodity energy transactions. And so the result is, take that 10% savings as your number. The financial institution is able to effectively, given the arbitrage between the taxable and tax exempt rate and the tax code, sell us the power purchase agreement that we signed at $50 back for effectively $45. So we're achieving a $5 or 10% savings on that contract because of the tax code opportunity.
Well, what I'll say is that's good enough for today and good enough for next Wednesday. I'm not there yet for the final authorization, and that's okay. I don't need to be there today. But
yeah, we're not
before the
necessarily.
next
I think this is complicated for sure. We need to.
Yeah.
We want to have.
This is the introduction.
conversations.
There will be more to come for sure. Understand?
And so I'm good for now. Thanks. Thank you, Chair.
Director Kalb, want to dive into the challenges of tax-free municipal tax bonds?
Oh, can you hear me? I'm trying to find. Oh,
Yes.
okay. Sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I appreciate the looking at the slides online. I don't have any. I mean, this is all. This always gets a little complicated, but I didn't have any particular questions. Appreciate the presentation though.
All right, I'll jump into my question. So we have active suppliers. So the reason for Morgan Stanley is we have a current relationship with them.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
The reason for selecting Morgan Stanley to draft up the documents or work as our prepay buyer, I think that's
Sure,
what
yeah.
it was.
Sorry, we sort of provide a little bit more of a summary form here versus what we'll present next week. But we issued an RFP, an open competitive solicitation, with a number of financial institutions that took part in that. And so we selected Morgan Stanley based off combinations of experience, price, and then, as I noted, their experience as a commodity supply, we felt like was a differentiator for them.
And did we have any of that kind of sort of environmental concerns? Sometimes we talk about how often they're invested in pipelines and other activities. Do we have any kind of social element that we've included in those RFPs? Or I don't think that's part of the scoring because we haven't really addressed that in this sort of the way we score RFPs.
That was not explicitly part of the scoring. I think in part, one of the reasons why I work with Morgan Stanley is because they're a partner that we've worked with on other transactions, felt comfortable with kind of their track record. Mm-hmm. Also, if you look at, again, any of the number of active suppliers, they're all very large financial institutions. So.
Yeah, and so maybe we look at the weight and the scale, possibly just highlighting this is why we have them and this is how they came in the RFP. This is why we're still moving forward with them. Just maybe that rationale to say Morgan Stanley is still the right choice for us as sort of our, I forget what the formal title is. Are they the prepaid buyer or signer? I forget what it's called.
Prepaid supplier.
Supplier. So two other questions. Let's see. What's the investment to create these documents? There is a cost associated with getting this vehicle created, isn't there?
Yeah. Again, and apologies. We tried to slim things down and really spend this time.
Oh, it's fine.
The action itself, but in the board meeting, of course, we'll include all of those details are included. So on the legal counsel itself, there's a number of different roles. It's going to be hard to verbally lay them all out, but there.
Oh, you don't have to do that high level. You don't have to go details.
There's bond counsel, there's tax counsel, there's disclosure counsel, there's issuers counsel, there's a prepay advisor. So there's a handful of roles that are also working on this transaction. The fees for any one of those roles can range from $50,000 to $400,000. So some of those fees will be laid out. So it's not inexpensive, but you can do those on a contingent fee basis. So only if you issue a bond and you're successful in sort of executing on that bond, will those fees be, be paid? And oftentimes they are paid out of the conduit itself, out of the proceeds of the bond. And the discount rates that we reference incorporate all of those fees as sort of part of it, as the sort of the net result.
So the revenue we would see from issuing this debt, that $50,000 to $400,000 would then be subtracted from the proceeds of those bonds. And we're always looking at that 8 to 12% discount, which is somewhat quantified by our CEO, fearless leader, Mr. Chassett, in regards to the potential revenue that we could maybe see in this vehicle. I think maybe quantifying that cost benefit analysis might be helpful if you're going to highlight more of the elements.
So,
and just one point there. I think one thing to think about, especially if you pursue the contingent, is when it's contingent, it's paid out of the proceeds of the issuance. And so then it's just part of, let's just say the savings would be 10.2%. Your savings are then going to be 10.5%. Again, I'm just making illustrative numbers. And the reason, you say, well, I have to accept the fact that I'm going to have slightly lower overall savings to get the documentation and the negotiations done. Well, there are no savings without those documents and without the negotiation. So it's really just, and then if you go contingent and you don't pursue an issuance, well, there's no cost to the agency. So I think when we think about it from a cost benefit, this is the cost of doing business. So there's not an alternative. The alternative is not pursuing the strategy, which is something that we will discuss further.
But it is on a contingent basis. So the only reason when we pay these fees would be once we issue this debt, and then we have a reduction because we are paying them out of those proceeds. But it's not like we have to pay upfront costs in case we choose not to go down this path and use this vehicle. Are we on the hook for anything?
That's right. You could certainly structure as a fixed fee basis. You can structure as a contingent fee basis, and I think we're looking primarily at it as a contingent fee basis.
They're amicable to that.
Yeah, and I'll just note for next week, what we're bringing forward the board specifically will be a total of $635,000 across a few different council roles. That would be bond counsel, tax counsel, issuers counsel, and disclosure counsel. Sorry, it's a mouthful, but four different roles.
And they are contingent basis. Those 635. Okay.
That's correct. Almost entirely on it.
Okay.
With one piece, which would be hourly to the extent it did move forward, but capped at $30,000. So somewhat minimal.
And I know when we had all these Sarbanes-Oxley conditions about after Enron, there's always the element of debt and not having it on the balance sheet, off balance sheet. And some people are surprised you have all this debt, you got to pay. And so it's going to be off balance sheet, but there will be a footnote on the financial records of this vehicle when we do issue statements.
I don't believe there would be a footnote. No, this is fully non-recourse, fully off balance sheet through a separate vehicle altogether.
But there would be a liability though, if somehow everything fell apart, then we would have to make sure we pay it back.
Nope, that liability is not on us. It is through the financial intermediary.
So your points 3 on your slide 5 says the prepay program terminates early, fails to perform whatever LLC forgoes the future savings and the signed PPA contracts put back to the original LSC. That's us, right?
The PPA gets put back.
PPA.
Not
the PPA.
The bond is fully off balance sheet. There's no asterisks there.
The bond. So where does, okay. So we might, I need to understand that better. I'm in the boat trying to understand that it's not, if the bond is debt, it's non-recourse debt. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
Okay. Because if it was recourse, that means it comes back to us, and you want to make sure you highlight that on your financial statements that this money is owed as a recourse loan, but this is non-recourse, it's at risk. The person who invests on this gets the tax benefit immediately, and we get the proceeds. I think, not sure if it's immediate, but you get the bond proceeds. And whether it is non-recourse in your bullet. Okay, cool. The next point, perfect. So many words, so much to tackle. So
I know this is a very complicated structure. There's still even more for me to educate myself with. So,
sure.
This was to introduce it.
Yeah.
to bring forth items to help explain it better. And certainly at some stage we'll bring Morgan Stanley. We can bring our financial advisor and counsel to further engage, help highlight these things a little bit better. There's a repetition aspect that is helpful as well. So please ask all the questions that you want, of course, but we will certainly make sure to properly educate before we actually take forward something to actually execute on the transaction.
Yeah, the only reason I have these questions because I know we've refinanced some debt in the city of San Leandro, so we knew we had a whole team to go through that and those savings and what have you, and there was a cost to it. So just clarifying that. I see Director Mendel's hand up. I think you have a comment? No?
No, I just forgot to lower it.
Okay,
Before.
no worries.
Sorry.
I think one more comment on my end is just, I forgot to share this, but one is that we are looking to execute this transaction with another CCA. That's
Okay.
Valley Community Energy. So we went jointly out there for the RFP, evaluate all of the services together. So the reason to do so really is to ensure that there's proper diligence. So there's two entities that are doing all of this diligence together. And we're also sort of splitting the overall notional size of another counterparty. So we would have less discount, of course, that we're sort of getting as a result of that. But, we feel like that was, a prudent decision given that it would be the first transaction that we would be doing of this nature. So working with another CCA was beneficial. And then I'll also know that there's another CCA, I think it's all public, that is looking at the prepay transaction. That's MCE. I won't go into details of status there because I'm not sure what is fully public there, but they are I would say a little further ahead than us in terms of looking at and launching this transaction. And then of course there are a handful of other CCAs that are absolutely interested in looking as well, but maybe a little bit further behind us. So we're not the only ones out there doing this type of diligence, trying to execute on this. So there is a collective group of folks that are properly evaluating this.
Okay, thank you for the explanation. Look forward to seeing more on this vehicle to help us offload some debt, receive some bond proceeds at a high level, right? Okay. I think if there's nothing else from Dr. Mendel or Director Kalb, we can go over to public comment.
Yes, we have two people on our speaker list, Audrey Ichinose and Barbara Stebbins. I am going to unmute Audrey Ichinose. Hold on one second, let me just pull up the timer. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I wanted to ask about the PPAs that you intend to assign to this vehicle. How many and what will be your criteria for selecting them? I saw some figure on the PowerPoint that indicated a minimum of like 300 million. Maybe that was a hypothetical or something, but how large do you intend to go with this prepaid transaction? Is that clear?
Yeah, I was just holding. I figured if there's more questions, we can take them all and then answer them.
Are there any other questions? Here's the question. No. Okay, so I guess we'll just respond to that question.
Address that. So yeah, we noted a notional size between 350 and 850 million dollars. I think on slide 3. So exact notional size is TBD, and that notional size is sort of a combination of our appetite and interest in terms of what to go out to market for, and of course what's sort of optimal, right? Just in terms of actually doing a bond raise. So that amount is over a 30-year period, keep in mind, right? So the actual amount that we're contemplating is probably somewhere in the middle there. And that equates to somewhere between, I would say, $10 to $20 million of annual notional for EBC. So that, that's equivalent to, 50 megawatt around the clock energy transaction. So really small percentage of our overall energy procurement is what would likely flow through something like this. It could be 50, it could be 100 megawatts, but either way, you know, our peak demand is something around 1,000 megawatts. So we're talking about 50 to 100 megawatts, you know, 5 to 10%. So somewhat small in that form of magnitude.
I see. Thank you.
Okay. We have Barbara Stebbins.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I also had real trouble understanding this, and I still have a question that I don't think you've answered, Howard, which is, what does Morgan Stanley get out of this? Like, where is the benefit to Morgan Stanley in this whole structure? Because here, let me just point this out. So, well, anyway, I guess it will fall under comments that I have also. So I'll go ahead and ask my other questions as well. So it sounds like the PPAs could be of any kind, right? It could be contracting with the city of Oakland to buy the electricity that they're generating on City Hall or something like that. But just that's a question too about kind of the type of PPA that could be involved. And then, oh, I guess this fits into my first question, really. You said the tax code opportunity for EBCE, right? Or is that really what the benefit is for Morgan Stanley? So I guess I'm still trying to understand that. And then I have a couple quick comments, which are that, you know, at this moment, when I'm sheltering in my house, not only because there's a pandemic that doesn't seem to want to go away, but because there is so much smoke that we can't be outside and breathe properly. And I know 1 out of 10 people in the state of Oregon have now been evacuated because of the number of fires and their severity. It's really hard to look at such abstract mechanisms for dealing with an essential to life for all of us, which is energy. And I guess a 30-year structure also feels unreal, because what is this all going to look like in 30 years? And then just to really bring it back to the fact that we advocate for local, resilient, sustainable energy resources that we can actually have control over here in our own backyards, because we think that that is the only way we're really going to survive into the future. So I'll just throw that out there. I realize it's pretty abstract compared to, or maybe that's too concrete compared to what we've just been talking about. But I do think it's really important to stay grounded in what the reality of climate change is throwing at us at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. I don't think I heard a question. I might have had a question there, but I'm not sure. I think we're good.
One of the questions was just what kind of PPAs could be issued, and generally would be, you know, any number of kind of wholesale PPAs that we transact under, you know, are allowed to be assigned into this type of a vehicle. You know, in some cases you have to get separate consents from the actual energy seller. So, you know, those are things that we would need to work through to make sure that we have you know, contracts are able to legally be sort of assigned through something like this. So, but you know, there's no reason they can't be. So, you know, any of the large kind of renewable energy PPAs, practically speaking, can be assigned to this, and a lot of the shorter term transactions that we work on as well can be. Obviously, there are some restrictions. You know, they need to be sort of source specified. So just sort of a generic, you know, supply agreement that doesn't have some source specified may run afoul of some of the regulatory rules. So that's something that I pointed to, like the emissions performance standard. Those are things that you have to be kind of aware of, and may direct you to certain transactions being you know, lower risk to put in there.
Can I also just throw out the benefit to Morgan Stanley? That was another question.
Oh, So Morgan Stanley, their treasury team actually utilizes the funds that you raise through the process. So that's the reason why there's an arbitrage. The taxable rates, which is what Morgan Stanley would raise at, the Treasury Department would raise at, or tax exempt rate. Because we're not actually prepaying the energy supply agreement, because otherwise it would sort of take out the whole counter energy seller in that instance.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I think just to clarify, I don't know that we're losing any local control. I think we're just looking at a vehicle for debt. So, thank you.
That is correct.
Okay.
Adrian, if you could put the slide deck back on as well. And sorry, I don't mean to cut if there are still questions.
No, I think we're ready to move forward.
We want to cover.
Yes, the August heat wave introduction.
Yes. So if you can go to the next slide, Adrian. I'll cover this, but I also have my colleague Mike Susko on, who provided some of the details. So if there are questions, I may point to him to ask and provide some additional commentary. But diving into this topic, as we are all aware, in California, we dealt with a pretty significant heat wave in the middle of August. And as a result of that, rolling blackouts that we experienced on August 14th and 15th across the state. This was, big cause of this was record heat that we experienced, so very significant demand throughout CAISO. There was some unanticipated loss of supply, and then some of the net import availability was low due to hot temperatures throughout the West. So outside of California, we may expect to import energy from Oregon or Washington and other areas. There was also very significant heat there. So sort of a confluence of a lot of those events resulted in up to 4 million customers experiencing an outage at some point or another. So a very significant event. CAISO did anticipate increased loads and high temperatures, obviously with the forecasted weather. And there were a number of orders and alerts to try to mitigate that risk. Obviously with the resulting blackouts, there was still quite a bit of criticism there in terms of sort of how that was managed. The confluence events I briefly mentioned there, yes, it was a historic heat wave. Well, we have some data and stats to sort of show on that. There were a couple of natural gas plants that tripped offline. So that was sort of unlucky circumstances. Fluctuations in some of the intermittent resources and the wind output specifically. And then critical shortages in imports, as I just noted. And then lastly, the bullet there, of course, as this is the specific risk was particularly in the evening ramp hours as solar generation fell off, as we all generally know, as you go into the 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 o'clock hours, solar drops off, high ramp as folks return to homes, although COVID that's a little different, but still significant ramps in the evenings. That was particularly stressing the system during the heat waves. Next slide, Adrian. This one, we want to just talk about the record heat a little bit to sort of put this in context. It's certainly typical to have heat waves during the summer, particularly in August in California and obviously elsewhere. These were record heat waves and persistent heat waves, I think is what, or persistent high temperatures, as you say, that are important to understand, right? So this was August 14th through August 19th. 6 straight days of consistent high temperatures, which is generally a long heat wave where you're typically able to get some cooling days in the evenings to allow for, to sort of counteract that high temperature. But in this case, day after day after day really, really compounds the impacts of that. And this was, in addition to persistent, record-breaking temperatures, right? So just few stats there and the bullets, Death Valley reached 130 degrees, highest temperature recorded worldwide since 1931. And then specifically in the Bay Area, which is obviously more temperate than many areas, still also breaking records, right? So Oakland hitting 95 is a record, San Francisco at 95, San Jose at 103. So very high temperatures. In the graph itself, you can see we kind of plotted Oakland and Livermore as some of the kind of bookends for what we see In addition to persistent and record-breaking high temperatures, you can also see part of the issue is, quite frankly, the forecasting is a little off. So you can see the blue line is the forecasted temperature, that's at the very bottom, and then the orange line is Oakland actuals. The Oakland actuals were higher than anticipated going into those days, right? So that's another part of the issue here when you have rolling blackouts is if you predict extremely high temperatures, at least there's certain things you can do to make sure units are available. And when you exceed those expectations, that's where you have some increased risk as well. Livermore was a little closer, but you can see a little bit more volatility there. The gray line is forecasted and the yellow line was actuals. There are some days where there's pretty significant gap there on the 15th, the 18th, the 19th, where actuals are significantly above forecast. So all of that is a significant contributing factor to what happened. Adrian, next slide there. So just talking a little bit more about the outages, you know, very significant loads as a result of those high temperatures. The CAISO issued orders restricting maintenance operations. They issued alerts for system reserves. They issued flex alerts. They called on customers to reduce their electricity consumption. So it really was sort of an all of the above approach to try to counteract the risk and the strain on the grid. Unfortunately, on the 14th and the 15th in particular, it was strained in a way where there were actual rolling blackouts. And so they were worst on those days than others. Again, part of that was due to a natural gas plant tripping offline, in addition to, of course, the persistent heat and some failed flex ramp tests, which means that prohibits certain imports that can come into the state. On the 16th and 17th, with some of the actions and the alerts and the call for conservation, you know, was able to avoid any additional rolling blackouts those 2 days and going forward. Next slide, Adrian. Call to action across California. Just wanted to detail a little bit in terms of the actions taken by CPUC, CAISO, load serving entities, and the governor's office, of course, getting involved as well. You know, the big one, of course, was conservation messaging. So if across the board, folks were reaching out to customers saying, you know, turn down your electricity, try to conserve, try to pre-cool, particularly in the hours of sort of 3 to 10 p.m. generally speaking, was a call to really try to conserve. You may have seen that yourselves in terms of various alerts that were coming out. On the demand side of things, you know, tried to call on as much demand response as possible. That was throughout the state. EB specifically, we have some demand response suppliers that are providing resource adequacy for us. You know, in terms of our validation, you know, we understand that they all performed during that time frame, so that's good. And then there were some unique actions. So like data centers were actually called on to use backup generation to help alleviate some of the drain on the grid. U.S. Navy and Marine Corps ship disconnections were called on. And then home battery charging adjustments, of course, were called upon as well. And then on the supply side of things, there was a capacity procurement mechanism, commonly known as a CPM. So that's where CAISO needs to go out and actually procure additional resources, and that does result in additional costs across really all load serving entities. So, so we saw that come through. There were some water adjustments to operations. CEC worked with San Francisco to maximize output at Hetchy, which they control. Work with other private power producers to sort of increase production as much as possible through things like concentrated solar PV. You know, PG&E deployed temporary generation, and that was intended for use for PSPS. And then similarly, LADWP and SCE also were called on for additional capacity. So really across the board, conservation, demand side, supply side were all sort of called on in order to try to mitigate the risks. Next slide, Adrian. So financial impacts. What did this mean for EBCE? You know, I'll walk through the table in a minute, but let me just first by touching on some of the bullets. The revenue reconciliation, which is a critical part of this, of course, is still in process. There were increased energy costs, no surprise, during that week. There were, of course, also increased revenues to help partially offset that. Those numbers are still being reconciled, and I would say part of the challenge is actually getting those numbers broken down on a day-to-day basis, because generally speaking, we bill customers on a monthly basis, and so different billing determines not the easiest process to say this day exactly what revenues generated. There are increase in revenues, of course. My expectation is that these days do operate at a loss with extreme weather, extreme demand, extreme costs. And we'll go into some of those details. With that said, EBC, we did meet all of our RA obligations, so our resource adequacy obligations for the year, and that certainly included August as well. So we were compliant, per the resource adequacy obligations. And then I would say we were also compliant in terms of our risk management guidelines and hedge targets. So we were there in terms of what we intended to procure, and this was a pretty anomalous event in terms of extreme heat conditions, and then the confluence of other events that sort of exacerbate that, resulting in rolling blackouts. So with that, let me touch on some of the numbers here to sort of help explain this bit of an eye chart here. We've detailed the 6 individual days between August 14th and August 19th, which I would say order of magnitude wise all sort of performed pretty similarly. Obviously a little bit of variation there. And then below that, you can see we provided an August average without those days, so without the heat wave. And then there's an August average that includes those heat wave days. And then we have the July average. And July average, I'll just note, is that's a pretty typical expectation, I would say. July average and even the August average outside of the heat wave, those are pretty typical sort of numbers that you would expect to see, right? So July in particular, you can see the hedge percentage was 98%. I'll note as a reminder, our hedge targets generally around the 90 to 95% level, depending on the month. Well, I should say 85 to 95% level. In your summer months where you have greater risks for extreme demand, you want to be more hedged. So you want to be on the higher levels, 95, maybe upwards of 100% hedged. In your cooler, more mild months, so your spring months, you aim for lower hedge targets because you don't have as much risk to say there's going to be some extreme blowout that would require more procurement. So you say sort of lower there. So you can see July, we were sort of right where you want to be. You were at the high levels there. And I'll note that, with COVID, we saw some load reductions. So that's why you see the number at 98%. That's definitely on the high end of the range for what you target. And that's partially because of COVID, and that's partially because July was just a mild month. Temperatures were a bit lower than normal. So it was a nice, cool, and comfortable month for us. And you can see in July, when you look at the numbers, kind of typical megawatt load, megawatt hour numbers are on the lower end of the side. And then you can see your energy and capacity costs. Now, those are costs related to your open position. So obviously July has a very small open position amount. And so that $747,000, that is reflective of a small open position and low energy prices. And then the next column over is your hedge performance. And you can see again, in a normal month like July, on average in a day, your hedges perform, meaning a negative number is your hedges are costing you money, right? That's what you would expect. You pay a little bit for insurance, right? And so if you go out there and you hedge, you're going to pay a little bit of money for that certainty. And it costs you a little bit of money, $100,000 to $200,000 per day. And then, of course, the net energy cost is just summing up your energy capacity cost column and your hedge performance column. So that's July on average, right? Now let's look at the individual days, August 14th through August 19th. You can see the hedge coverage percentages there, they drop. They drop because your load is significantly higher than you expected when you put on those hedges a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year ago, right? And so when you have a demand blowout, which can increase by 20, 40, 50%, your hedge percentages are going to drop. In this case, you can see they drop to probably on average around 75% across those days. And obviously the column over in load, you can see your load goes from 16, 17, 18,000 megawatt hours to over 20, right? So very significant increase, and your energy and capacity costs, of course, will increase because prices are significantly higher, and your open position that you need to go procure is significantly higher. The good news is your hedges perform really well, right? So all of our hedges are all in the money, right? Power prices were more expensive than our hedges. That makes sense. Your net energy costs, unfortunately, you can see pretty significant, right? So -2, -3 million dollars for each of those days. They add up very quickly. You can see again for August average without those days, kind of where those levels are, pretty in line with July as an average. And then August average as a whole, incorporating that heat wave, the numbers aren't good, right? Your net energy costs are about $1.5 million per day. Your revenue's increasing to offset some of that, but not all. So, I think there's some lessons learned here. We don't just throw our hands up and say, well, this is an extreme heat event, so there's nothing you can do about it. But there is a little bit of that, right? Because you expect some heat waves and you don't want to always be procured 98%, or certainly you wouldn't want to be procured 120% just for these fluke events. You pay a lot of money for that when you generally pay for this insurance type product. But you can see there are some times that is, deals a blow to you financially, and you have to manage that risk on both ends, right? So we'll definitely reassess our risk policies and our hedge matrix to ensure we continue to evaluate and constantly tinker with, are we hedging at the right levels? How do we balance the costs and the benefits here of procuring more energy ahead of time? Unfortunately, the situation here is that the hedges are wrong way hedges, right? When you want them the most, that's when you have less. And it's difficult to counteract that, because by the time the weather forecasts are predicting spikes in energy, your energy costs increase very significantly. So that's the financial summary. Next slide, Adrian. Day ahead. And so this is just illustrative of the actual day ahead and real-time pricing that you saw clearing each of the heat wave days. We've just selected the kind of the sort of peak year hours. So that's hours 16 through 22. Those are sort of like evening ramp hours that I noted. Obviously your hours outside of that, your non-peak hours, those are between sort of $30 to $80. And $80 is still very high, mind you, for those hours. You would typically see pricing in sort of like the $30 range. And so you can see here, obviously, you get pricing up, in the hundreds of dollars on your peak hours on certain days, getting $800, approaching $1,000. That is very, very extreme. The red bars are your day ahead. We generally schedule our load in day ahead, of course. And then real-time pricing is your blue dots. You can see there's some variation there, of course, and that all has to do with predictability of weather, predictability of your load, things like that. More of our exposure is certainly day ahead, but if your load forecast is off, then you have more exposure to real-time markets, and you can see there are certain times and days where your real-time pricing was significantly more than your day ahead, has the potential to be more volatile. Next slide, Adrian. Actual load versus day ahead load. So this is the other thing that's important to touch on. You obviously want your load forecast to be as accurate as possible. We work with work quite a bit internally and with vendors to try to best predict our load given weather predictions and other things like that. That gives more of your exposure to day ahead as opposed to real time. But as you saw on the prior page, we had day ahead prices were very significant. So a very accurate load forecast does not alleviate you of those costs in any way. You're still very much so exposed to it. You may have a little less volatility exposure to the real-time markets, but you can see that our actual load, which is the blue line, and our orange load, which is the forecast load, are pretty close, right? Some days closer than others, of course, but in the grand scheme of things, pretty close. What we're showing here is in a normal weather time frame, you can see the gray line is significantly below. So, in your peak hours, you have close to 50% more demand than you would have in normal time frame. That is, of course, exposed to those high dollar values and has some of those financial implications that we talked about. Last slide, Adrian. So, what do we do about this, right? There are certainly system-wide actions for reliability improvement. These are things that we are looking to help and address, and these are things that, CAISO-wide folks are being called on to address and CPUC and CAISO will be evaluating going forward. And that's one, you got to improve your peak demand forecast process and ensure that you can account for some extreme events like these. These are outlier type events, but it seems like year after year, we continue to have, record heat year after year. So you have to start to plan for those things and account for extreme situations. As part of that, of course, you review your resource adequacy obligations. Your load forecasting equates to certain resource adequacy obligations. Ensure you have capacity with plants ready to deliver if necessary. You try to enable as many distributed energy resources and load flexibility as possible, right? We're looking at demand response programs. We're looking at our resiliency program, of course, that specifically is to install storage on behind the meter residential housing, both low income and non. And those are resources that can help alleviate some of the pain here. You have to review your capacity from solar and wind resources. We saw with intermittent resources that can exacerbate some of the risk and issues at certain hours in particular. CPUC did already order new capacity online by 2023. That was part of the IRP. That's something that we're satisfying as well. So all load serving entities have some portion of that 3,300 megawatts. Looking at ways to expand demand response programs, increase battery storage, and also extend contracts with gas generators. So, gas generation obviously is a way to alleviate some of the ramping demand that is required in some of the extreme heat scenarios. So I know that was a mouthful. That was an overall summary on the heat wave. There's one more slide. I know it's a different topic, but maybe I'll just touch on it really quickly. So we have an RFO plan for the fall. It is a renewables and storage RFO. We're planning to issue in that October-November timeframe. You can see a variety of energy products that we're planning to go out with. That is a follow-on to, of course, the IRP work that we've done. We're going to be presenting to the board a short summary this morning, more information in the October meeting on some of the IRP analysis and what's sort of driving our procurement decisions here and what we plan to go out with. We are looking at eligible products which are 10 megawatts in size or larger in both in-state and out-of-state projects so that we can try to diversify them. Questions to the board?
RFO is a request for offer?
Yes, request for offers, correct.
Great. I think Director Mandel has a question.
Yeah, just quickly. So glad to see the RFO coming forward again. And then it looked like, if I'm doing the math right, that that extreme weather event, that 6-day event, increased our cost above normal by around 9 million or so, something in that ballpark, and that there will be an increase in revenues that will partially offset that, but the net negative impact on our budget for the year will be in the low 7 digits. Is that, am I sort of getting the basics of that impact from a financial perspective? You're muted, Howard.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that's generally correct. I think the comparison is probably between August average and July average. And so you can say the energy impacts was probably more like $10 to $15 million, order of magnitude wise. I think you may have been comparing August average to August average without
I was, yep.
The heat wave. So, there's no perfect way to say which is the comparison because so many things drive what's normal. But I would say it's probably in that $9 to $14 million range. It's a little bit wider. And yes, revenues will offset some of that, but not all.
Yeah, and that's to be expected. I don't want to have that misinterpreted as criticism. We can't, purchase hedges that account for, the hottest days ever on record and that kind of thing. That's just sort of silly and wouldn't expect staff to have done that in advance. I fully expected that heat wave to impact our budget negatively. I'm just trying to get a sense of the magnitude, and I'm hearing low 7 digits, which is unfortunate but understandable.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. I'm not seeing Director Kalb's hand up, so I'm assuming he does not want to speak unless he would like to speak. Going back to slide 13, I was looking at, if we could just clarify on the day ahead of real-time hourly pricing. If Adrian can go back to that. On the, it says the 18th, well, excuse me, on the section to the far right where you have the blue dots on the 18, 19, the day average is in the about 1,000, and you have the blue dots near 0. Are you able to just clarify what that means for me? I know I was trying to understand the day ahead is when that's the price you're going to see, but the real-time pricing is near 0. Can you just help illustrate that inversion?
Yeah,
maybe?
I mean, generally speaking, if your day ahead pricing is high and your real time pricing is low, it means that temperatures probably came in lower than expected. And so directionally just meant that the actual demand was lower than expected. And so real time pricing tends to be really low. That is pretty strange to have that type of a difference. I don't know if Mike, you have any more insights into that. That's something that maybe we can follow up with in the regular board meeting to sort of better explain that. But at least directionally, what I just shared, that would be the dynamic.
That's exactly right, Howard. Just depends on how the day ahead traders view, the following day, and then how that temperature actually shows up in the real time market. So it's one of those things where you expect high temps and they don't get there, or vice versa.
Thank you. And on that previous slide, I think we were talking about earlier the financial impacts. We're looking at the hedges that helped us offset capacity costs. Thank you, Mike, again for that clarification. That's science and a bit of art, I think, back on slide 13. I think we're looking at on slide 12, though, the energy capacity cost. I mean, it was like on day August 14, it was about $5 million, and the hedge helped us save $1.6 million. So, and that energy cost was 3.2, which is what's going to hit the bottom line, and so forth and so on until the 19th. That's where you have those $10 million plus, and then you can look at what maybe would have been the loss below that. So just still on slide 12, I think that's how I'm reading it, and there's a lot of information provided to us, but is that generally correct?
Yeah, I think that's right, the way that you're interpreting that.
Okay, and you said you're also going to look at these graphs and look at other extreme heat days and how to prepare for those and see what kind of trends you have, and those forecasts you do. I think we're back on slide 9. When do you do those forecasts? Is that something that's just the day ahead forecast? So going back to slide 9, you talked about Oakland forecast and Livermore forecast and those actuals. When are those forecasts done? Is that your forecast?
So just to be clear, those are temperature forecasts. So we're not uniquely determining our own temperature forecast. Load forecasts, of course. So we look at temperature forecasts and we try to incorporate that and the impacts of that into our load forecast. So if the load forecast is under forecasted, if the temperature forecast is under forecasted, then our load is probably also going to be under forecasted. And so that would give us more exposure to real-time pricing in that circumstance.
And where does this forecast come from? Like Almanac, or what are we looking at? KTVU News at 10 o'clock with Bill Murray. What are we looking at?
Can you comment on this source here?
Yeah, these are the weather stations, the respective weather stations. Okay. So that's an internal data from our analytics team that capture that weather station information.
Okay.
You're pulling directly from data sources that actually pull directly from weather stations, as opposed to like a weather subscription service, like an AccuWeather or something like that. That's what you mean.
Okay, I was just curious.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, just
the way they do that. Sorry, one more insight. There's just the way they do that forecasting is they do try to look specifically at different stations throughout our territory.
Okay.
As we have some good diversity in terms of weather patterns there. This is just a sample, not everything we look at.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how we can sort of get better forecasting in partnership with those sources and help us out there for the real-time and day-ahead pricing or hedges we do. Thank you for that clarification. I appreciate it. Do we have other comments we're supposed to take now from the public after this piece? Look to Adrian. I think I see a hand raised. I'm not sure it's from before or if the public speaker had another comment.
Hold on one second. I am checking right now. I don't see anyone. Let me just refresh this. No one is on. There are no more people on the public comment list. And I am checking our
I think
participants.
Ms. Audrey wants to speak, and then we have a.
We do have, yes, Audrey and Chuck Roselli. I would like to speak. I'll go ahead and unmute Audrey first.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, thank you very much. I am interested in one of Howard's comments about resource adequacy performance, EBCEs. So you were satisfied, and what do you mean by that? I guess it would be really interesting to hear briefly how that resource adequacy is drawn upon by CAISO or could you give us a better idea of that and of your judgment that EBCE did okay with?
That's your final question?
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay.
Sure. So yes, I did note that EBC satisfied our resource adequacy obligations. Every load serving entity has resource adequacy obligations. So we satisfied the system obligations, meaning that we had procured enough capacity in the form of resource adequacy that we were required to do so. So that hopefully that answers that question. As it pertains specifically to how CAISO draws on that, I mean, there are very specific and pretty detailed resource adequacy rules. So if a power generating unit is selling resource adequacy as a capacity product, then they have to comply with that in a variety of ways of being available. They must offer in certain hours to sort of demonstrate that they are available, and that is the purpose of capacity, is to ensure that units are available to be drawn upon. And so CAISO and CPUC sort of established those rules pretty clearly as to how they have to perform, and therefore the grid should be able to call on those resources in extreme times like this.
Can I add though that is there some way that CAISO or the CPUC evaluates how close you come to that or how far away from satisfying the RA obligation? I guess I'm concerned about whether that will go up in the future, which so I wonder if you could, there's no other, you can't make a finer statement about how EBCE did. There's no sort of finer accounting.
It's not there's a very specific number that we have to go procure as it relates to resource adequacy month to month.
Right.
And there's a year ahead number, there's a month ahead number, and so you have to go procure a certain megawatt of resources in a particular month for system RA, and we procured the obligation. So there's not like there's a very explicit accounting and a sort of a filing process that is completed with CPUC. And so I guess the short answer is yes, there is an accounting process, and we satisfied it. I'm not sure what additional detail you're asking for there. In terms of projections for future resource adequacy requirements, I would anticipate resource adequacy requirements probably will increase in the future. I think they probably would have been increasing regardless of the heat wave, but I think issues like that exacerbate. I shouldn't say exacerbate, but probably would lead to more increased resource adequacy obligations, relative to what we have today. But all of that has to do with some of the actions that we identified related to looking at peak forecasts, load forecasts, looking at how much capacity value resources like solar and wind get. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I just do want to tack on, this idea of really urgency with, you know, developing distributed energy resources and you know, think about microgrids and other storage. It was apparent to me in that stretch of August that that demand response really, and I'm including in that, you know, the lessening of demand really was useful in preventing further, you know.
My apologies, Audrey. I apologize for muting you, but we have to move on with the with other speakers on the list. We have Chuck Rosselli on the speaker list as well.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Clerk.
Am I on?
Yes. Please.
I guess the question I was going to ask is, have you guys taken a look at how much additional local resource you might have had available or could potentially make available fairly easily if in fact the like the across the street rules were relaxed, you know, the PUC 218 restriction and also the various restrictions against charging and discharging of batteries at certain times? Because it seems to me that if in fact you could make a case for that being a significant resource, that's potentially an additional cost benefit. If I'm reading it right, you could potentially save some of this $10 million extra if in fact that was available to you. And we're all looking for those kinds of arguments, it seems to me, in order to go back to CPUC and try to get those rules relaxed.
Any other comments? There's some good stuff there. Just want to make sure I hear your comments before your time is up.
That was the last comment.
Any feedback on the comments, staff?
Yeah,
Howard?
yeah, on that one, you know, I mean, conceptually, I think that makes sense. I think we have to evaluate that a bit further, understand what resources are there, and obviously there's that would require some, you know, material regulatory changes to actually allow the counting of those resources. But you know, certainly that makes sense, and we should further look at that. We will.
Seems like Chuck has his hand back up. Maybe we give him a second to clarify any other final comments. Adrian.
Can you repeat that, please?
Can we allow Chuck to finish his last 2 minutes if he has any other clarifying comments?
You want me to unmute?
Please.
Okay, great.
And we're coming at the top of the hour.
Okay.
Chuck's got to unmute himself. Themselves.
Did you hear that?
Now we hear you, sir. Go ahead and finish your last couple minutes if you may.
I guess my quick comment on that was there are a number of organizations working on those regulatory changes right now, including the combined CCAs in their response to the 1339 proceeding. And the kind of information that you might have specifically on the potential impact on you, I think would be very useful in support of those comments. I guess what I'm saying is you don't necessarily have to wait for the regulatory change to occur. I think you could be part of it if we use that information properly.
And Mr. Rosal, do we have your contact information?
I don't know. I think so. I put down my email address and phone number when I first signed in.
Perfect. So Adrian, if you can maybe share that information with Howard so they can maybe communicate further on this.
Yeah, I mean,
potential
in fact,
resolution for support.
I'm involved with the 350 Bay Area, and we are a party. So if you want to go that route, we can do that.
All right. If it's possible to Howard to understand this further, that'd be helpful to see how we can leverage the community to help us maybe save some of that $10 million in the future heat waves. That'd be ideal.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that fine, Howard and Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. I was not suggesting that we would wait for the regulatory rules to change, I was suggesting that we would be part of that change. But yeah, makes sense.
Well, you're a passionate individual looking to help. So it's always like, take the help when we can get it, right? Or possibly provide more information. That's it. All right. Any other comments from the committee? I think that's all we have. And I think Mr. Rosali maybe can put his hand down possibly. I think we're good there. And Adrian, do we have any other items of business? I think maybe not commissioners, but member comments?
There's no one else on the speaker list. We can go ahead to committee and staff announcements.
Perfect. Let's see, committee members, any other comments or thoughts?
Nope.
This is Dan. I don't have anything.
Perfect. For me, my only thought is the Resilient Home, wondering how that program is doing. I've been doing some research into talking with someone about possibly putting some solar and battery on my home. And I know there's an incentive there to do that, but I just wanted to make sure there's any kind of progress. Maybe we can hear about that at the board meeting or subsequent.
We may be too late for the board meeting since they're agendizing right now. So we didn't have a planned item there, but happy to provide an update perhaps in the executive committee or in the next board meeting after that. But the short summary of that is the program is going well. And as you just noted, Sunrun is in the process of reaching out to customers throughout the territory to, start to try, find interested customers to do those deployments. So I think that from what I've heard at a high level is that is going smoothly, and seems to be quite a bit of interest.
Yeah.
I can get a more meaningful update though in the next meeting.
Okay, and if you bring it back to the finance committee meeting in October 9th, that's fine, or the next board meeting. I think there's a sort of an escalation point that I've learned that you have this sort of critical sort of space that you have more incentives, and as you go down the line, but you qualify, there's more of a rebate or gift card program that Sunrun is in partnership with East Bay Community Energy is offering when you put the solar with storage, about $12.50, I think, at the end of the day, to offset the cost or potential effort to do so. All right, let's see. Do we have anything else? Any other comments from staff?
No comments from staff.
Okay. So we'll, let's see. We'll adjourn then. And also just remembering today is September 11th. So we did, remember that we'll never forget. So if we take a moment of silence to remember those who lost their life day 19 years ago now, and then we'll adjourn from there. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your weekend, and we'll connect again October 9th, I believe at 3 o'clock for the next financial committee meeting, and we'll see you at the next board meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.